Hello, and welcome back to the third video of this series on the 62 most instructive games of all time. This time, in this video, we're going to be looking at a game between Boleslavsky and Lisitsin again. And in this one, what is instructive is the lengths that Boleslavsky goes to get his knight on a good square on an outpost in a hole in black's position. So let's see how he goes about doing that. So we get e4, c5, Sicilian, knight f3, d6, and d4 going into the open Sicilian, knight f6, knight c3, g6, so going to a dragon, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3. So f3 is quite a well-known move to anyone that plays the Sicilian because it prevents this knight to g4 move, which would threaten the bishop on e3 because black would ideally like to get rid of white's dark squared bishop, so there's nothing to contest his important dark squared bishop that's being kept on the king side. So, and f3 also kind of prepares a kingside pawn storm, which is a common kind of plan in this position against the dragon Sicilian. And this kind of setup is what's called the Yugoslav attack against the dragon, and it's what Fischer claimed made the dragon bad. That it fundamentally proved that the dragon Sicilian doesn't work. White just goes for this Yugoslav attack, and even weak players can beat grandmasters using it, according to Fischer. And the idea is that white just attacks on the king side, leading with these pawns to weaken the black king's position before bringing all his pieces over for a kingside attack. But we'll see what happens in this game. We get castles, queen d2. Also a very common move. You know, if white wants to, white can trade off black's dark squared bishop with bishop h6. We get knight to c6, and then castles queenside. Opposite side castling is a very common strategy, again against the dragon Sicilian. It fits this kind of plan that white is going to attack on the king side, so wants his king on the queen side so he can bring all his pieces onto the king side and push those pawns and attack black. Whereas black, on the other hand, is going to attack on the queen side because, well, this is where white has castled, and this is where black can get some attacking chances. Obviously, the dark squared bishop looks across to the board. Sometimes the A or B file becomes open. Obviously, the C file is already open, and black is just going to push these pawns. So we get knight takes on d4, and bishop takes on d4 back. If instead of knight takes on d4, if black tries this very kind of freeing move of d5, then we would get something like knight takes on c6, b takes on c6, e takes on d5, c takes on d5, knight takes on d5, knight takes on d5, queen takes d5, and then queen c7. This is known theory. This is actually part of my own repertoire. I have this. Black gives up the rook on a8, but then can play bishop f5 with tempo, obviously threatening checkmate on c2. White first takes the rook with check, king takes, so maintaining that checkmating threat, and then rook d2. And then it's unclear. The computer prefers black. However, white's got two rooks for a queen, so under the right circumstances, white can be better here as well. And indeed, in terms of points, materials, points. White is up 2 points here. So black doesn't go for this in this game. Instead, we get knight takes on d4, bishop takes d4, queen a5, and king b1. And now this is threatening to play knight to d5 because queen takes queen doesn't come with check anymore. So black plays e5, and now obviously has this large hole on d5 that white can try to take advantage of. If instead of e5, if they played something like rook b8, following the plan for black, bringing the rook to the b file, pushing that b pawn, then we would get knight d5, and because the king's on b1, black can't trade queens with check. So if black tried to trade queens now, white can throw in this knight to e7 check first before recapturing. And then if black retreats with queen d8, then we'd get knight takes f6 check, bishop takes f6 check. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, e takes f6, and then white wins the d pawn. Or if we go back to here, if black takes the knight straight away, then obviously the queen just hangs. So instead, black plays this e5 move. White retreats with bishop e3. We get bishop e6, developing the bishop and also trying to control this d5 square. One, to prevent the knight coming there, but also with the idea that hopefully they can eventually push this pawn to d5, and then the pawn isn't a weakness anymore, and black's position will be fine. We get pawn to a3 from white. This, I think, prevents b5, b4 from black, dislodging the knight. We get rook f to d8. Again, black wants to push this pawn to d5 to get rid of that weakness. Now, knight to b5. And queen to a4. So, black could trade queens here. But after rook d2, white is threatening to capture the pawn on d6, and if black defends that, then white has knight c7, hitting the rook and hitting the bishop, so would trade off this nice bishop and have a positional edge there. So rather than trading queens, we get queen to a4, and then here is the very instructive moment in the game, which is an immediately obvious why. We get pawn to c4. So you'll notice that this is a pawn sacrifice. The pawn is attacked twice by the bishop and the queen, and only defended once by the bishop. And the point is that white wants to trade off this light squared bishop because it's one of the pieces that's controlling the d5 square. And he's saying it's worth giving up a pawn to do that. So, and the other thing is c4 prevents black from pushing d5, so black has to take this pawn. It's actually interesting that instead of c4, white did actually have knight to c7, which attacks the rook, and then if the rook is saved, we get bishop e5, winning the queen. So white actually did miss that. It's also worth looking at, what happens with knight takes d6. Well, we'd get a6 first of all to prevent bishop e5 again, and then we get bishop c5 instead. Bishop f8, trying to win that piece. Queen to c1, and then queen to c6, and black would win a piece here. So white can't win a pawn straight away by taking on d6. So yeah, instead we get c4. We get bishop takes c4, so it is a pawn sacrifice. Then we have knight to c3 with tempo on the queen. So queen goes to b3. Now the bishop takes on c4. Queen takes c4. And you'll notice that white has sacrificed a pawn, but has got rid of that light squared bishop, one of the pieces that was controlling d5. And now white goes after the other piece that's controlling d5, which is the knight, and plays bishop g5. So the knight is pinned, and white will be free to capture it on the next move, then allowing the knight, his own knight, to come to d5. So we get queen e6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and knight to d5. So that knight has finally come to d5, where it looks absolutely fantastic. It's unmovable. There isn't a black piece that can push it away. There's no pawns, and there's no knight, and there's no light squared bishop. So white has got this wonderful, unmovable knight on d5, and it's come at the price of a pawn. So he had to sacrifice a pawn to get this wonderful knight. So it's a beautiful example of positional understanding, that the knight belongs on d5, and then he asked the question, okay, how can I get it there? Well, let's try and trade the bishops. I can do that by sacrificing a pawn, and then I will trade off the other piece controlling d5, which was the knight, and then my knight will be free to get to d5. And then from here, white completely controls the game with this knight on d5. Lots of tactics become available because of that knight, and we'll see that it's very much worth the pawn that he sacrificed. So we get queen to h4. The idea that that black wants to blockade these pawns. So for example, if white plays g3 now, then we'd get queen h3, and white wouldn't be able to push these pawns anymore. So instead of g3, we get queen to e2, bishop to f8. The idea that black tries to control this e7 square, so there is, less chance of some knight forks happening here, but obviously it gives up the f6 square, where maybe some forks can happen anyway. And then we get queen to f1, and now when we get g3, the black queen can't come to h3 because the queen will take. So black can no longer blockade these pawns. We get rook to a to c8, taking control of the file, doing what he can to make the most out of the position. But the real action is happening on the king side. So we get g3, queen g5, h4, pushing those pawns, leading with the pawns. We get h6. It's actually quite interesting to see that what happens if black takes this pawn, because it looks like a free pawn. But what we get is knight e2, and then some random move from black, let's say a6, followed by rook g2, and then that attack is looking pretty tasty for white. So black doesn't take that pawn on g3, black goes to h6 instead. Now g4 keeps coming with those pawns, g5, hoping that he can close up the position on the king side, but white says no. We get h takes g5, queen takes g5, and then rook's h5, and queen g6. Here, black has to start being careful that he doesn't fall into any sort of knight forks with knight to f6. We get g5 and h6. Obviously, here if queen takes the rook, then we do get knight f6 check. So that is the advantage of having this beautiful knight. All these tactics suddenly appear and they help out with the attack. So yeah, instead of queen takes, we get h6, and rook takes h6. Again, the bishop can't take this rook. If bishop takes, then we get knight to e7 check instead, a different fork. So we get queen takes g5, rook to h5, and then in this position, black resigned. Again, obviously, if queen takes rook, then it's the same knight fork on f6. If instead something like queen g6, then we get queen h1, threatening a lot of nasty stuff on the h file. Queen to e6, and if something, something like rook to e8, whatever, then obviously we get rook to g1, winning the queen. So black wants to get that queen off the same file as the king, but as soon as he does that, we have rook h8 check, king g7, and queen h7 checkmate. So yeah, black resigned in this position because he saw all that. And this is just a great example of obviously a crushing attack, a crushing kingside attack that was facilitated by having a beautiful knight on d5. And then the real instructive moment is how that knight got to d5, which basically came from capturing and trading off black's pieces that controlled that square, using quite inventive measures. So sacrificing a pawn to lure one of the pieces out for trade, and then pinning the other piece, the knight, on f6. And once those were removed, the knight was free to move to d5 and have a beautiful outpost there and help out the attack with all these knight fort tactics. And then it was also very nice to see how white finished this off, pushing all those pawns and opening up the king, and using his rooks along with the threat from the knight to eventually force black to resign. So if we just bring up our list of key learnings again from this game, the first one is, well, if you don't know already, holes are weak squares in the position that can't be controlled by pawns. So in this case, it was the d5 square. There was no pawns that could control that. And holes are often a weakness in a position that should be avoided. Black thought that he could get away with it in this position. He thought that he'd eventually be able to either control that d5 square or eventually push the d6 pawn, so it wasn't a weakness anymore, but white didn't allow that. And that comes on to the next point, which is don't allow your opponent to push these weak pawns and rid themselves of that weakness. And here white came up with a very inventive way of preventing that. We saw from the game as well that the knight on an unchallenged outpost is an extremely strong piece, and additionally leads to a lot of tactical chances that can help with an attack, as well as generally controlling key squares in the enemy position. And to get a knight there, it can sometimes be worth giving up a pawn. Like in this game, we saw that that pawn didn't matter at all for the rest of the game. It was very clear that it was worth giving up for to get a strong knight onto an outpost. And maybe the key thing to remember from this game is, in order to reach an outpost, so you've identified a nice square for your knight to go to, then you've got to think about how to get it there. And often you'll have to trade off pieces that control that square, so that your knight can be there unchallenged. And yeah, more abstract way of saying that is, generally identify your good squares for your pieces and then think about how to get there. And that might be different depending on the position, but one example is trading off pieces. So that is game 3, and hopefully it's instructive for people, and I will come back with another instructive game next time.